Hey guys, and welcome to the show. So today's video is going to be extra special because we're actually going to be integrating with our Node.js backend. Now before we begin, please be sure that you are subscribed and hit that bell notification icon so you can get a notification about the very next part that comes out. And like this video if you like what's going on here. You can also comment about what you want me to tackle in the series. I'm actually going to be releasing two parts to do with the integration, at least the immediate integration. This part's going to be all about getting player data, seeing if we've got some saves. And then the second part of this is going to be all about creating new saves and creating a new game, creating new data on our SQLite 3 database via our Node.js server. Right, so what I've got here on the screen is, it's just our skeleton. It has continue, new, exit. If we click exit, it's going to exit. New is not going to do anything for now. That's going to be the second half of this integration phase. Continue is going to take us to our saves. Right now it doesn't actually check. If we just click continue, this is the save screen. We can go back. In this video, we want to actually disable this button if there are no saves to go to. And then also when we click on it, this is where it's going to list all the little saves that the user can choose to continue with. So let's actually go and exit this and check out our blank project. And then here in the background, I've got our server. I haven't made any other changes to this from last time. So we're just going to keep that. I'm not going to actually run it yet because the very first thing we need to do in this application is create two objects that are going to handle our loading and errors. So for example, if the server says there's an error, because we do handle errors, then it's going to tell the user something's gone wrong. And if data is loading, we also want to see that data is loading. We don't want the user to be sitting there not knowing what's going on. Okay, so we won't actually start that just yet. Alright, so let's take a look at our sprites first. I have got a series of cubes to represent the adventure sprites. I haven't had time to find actual real sprites, but we can introduce something a little bit more tasteful later on. For now, they're just different colors, going from 1 to 8. I think we're only using maybe 3 or 4 of these, but I've just included the entire series so that we don't get any errors. We've got a back button. These have multiple sub-images, hover effects and whatnot. Continue, exit, these all work the same way. We've got our new, we've got retry. This is going to be used if there's an error, so it's going to say an error is occurred. And you can hit retry to restart the game. And then our loading, this is just going to rotate as our loading animation. And then objects, we've got our parent button. It has the hover effect mainly. Over here in the creator saying image speed is 0, so it doesn't flick between them without interacting. Default enabled. Step event is saying that the image index is a ternary operator if the position meeting mouse X, Y, and with the child of this parent, then it's going to be enabled. And it's enabled, so it's allowed to be enabled. Then the image index is going to be 1, so that's the hover effect, otherwise it's 0. Image alpha is all about enabled, so if we're not enabled then it's going to be half, so kind of transparent, otherwise it's going to be fully opaque. And then visible, so long as we're not loading and there isn't an error, so error is blank, then it should be visible, because what we're going to have is when the application is loading or there's an error, we only want those two pieces of information, or one at a time I suppose, because they won't both be true, to be shown on the screen. You don't want the user actually interacting with any of the other buttons if there's an error or if it's loading. Let's start with our back button over here. It inherits everything from that parent. The only difference is it's got left pressed, which takes us to the main menu. This is the button actually only shown on the save screen. So once you click continue, you can actually go back to the main menu. Then the continue, we're actually going to be spending a lot of time in here. We have the create event. We have to put event inherited when inheriting from parent events. Then we want this just to be in the center of the room on the X axis. Step event is just standard from parent, and then left pressed. Here it's saying if we're not enabled, then any click will just be ignored, otherwise we'll go to room saves. Then object exit, again inherits from parent, middle of the room, same thing, and this is going to end the game. Object new over here, let's see what this does. So again, inherits from the parent, center of the room, and for now we're just going to set this to false enabled, so we can't actually use it because that's going to come later on. And again, if not enabled, return. Object saves is blank for now. And object selector, this is actually going to be, well, it's going to allow us to click between the little saves. So you show that we're selecting different ones. It's kind of out of scope of this part of the tutorial, but I just put it in here for fun so we can actually see that we can interact with those saves. And then as far as our rooms go, if we go to room main, let's see what we got. We got the continue, new, and exit. We don't have any creation code, but we're going to be putting some stuff in here in a second. New is blank, room saves. Here at the top left, we've got object saves. So that's the guy that's going to be interacting with rendering and fetching data for the screen. And also we've got the back button. And then room world is just blank. We'll touch on this at a later stage. Alright, so I said I actually wanted to handle the loading first. So that's going to be the loading and the errors. So let's go ahead and create a new object over here. We're going to call this guy object loading. And we can get our room, get rid of all of these. I'm going to make him persistent because then I can plunk him in the first room and then it'll just work everywhere. And also let's give him a centered position. So that's room width divided by 2 and y is going to be equal to room height divided by 2. And we want him to animate, right? So step event, let's say image angle minus equals 5. And we should type that right. And we'll only make it visible if we're loading. So we're going to have global variables for those two, while loading and error are going to be globals. So every step this is going to be rotating, whether or not it's visible, it doesn't really matter. But if it's loading, then it's visible. And that's it. So if we go to our main room and we drag in object loading. Oh, we have to give it a sprite too, don't we? Sprites loading. Okay, that's done. We're going to go to main. We can just put this anywhere. Top left. That's going to center itself and do its animation when it's ready. Now next we're going to create the object error. And object error is also persistent. Now for this guy it's slightly different because while he is just a message, going to have some string on the screen saying what the problem is. I also want to incorporate him with this guy, with a sprite retry, right? Because then we could say that this guy could have a message saying, an error has occurred, please try again, and then you can also get them to just click this sprite to retry in one go. And because of that, I'm actually going to give it the parent of object button, and I'm going to give it the sprite of retry. But there are some other things outside of like a button over here. So in our create, I also want to say, so I'm going to say add create. Always remember our event inherited. Then I want to give it the centered experience over there, and we also need to override the step event. Same thing, event inherited. And here, similar to what we did with the loading. Remember loading we said, whoopsie. Remember in loading in the step event we had this visible global loading. So now in an object error, I'm going to say visible equals, and here I'm going to say not global.loading and global.error is not equal to a blank empty string. So as long as there's a real error and we're not busy loading, it's going to show that error. Now we want to say add event, left pressed. So if they click retry, we're going to do game start. And now remember we had this global error property, we can actually draw that to the screen. So let's say draw. We need to have draw self because we've already got a sprite. Then let's draw set color, and we're going to say see red. Then we want to set the alignment, draw set is it H alignment? Always get these confused. FA center. Oopsie. Okay, very good. And we want to draw text room width. Let's put this in the center. Let's say y minus 100 because remember y, x and y are going to be where the button is. So let's put this above the button. And here we're going to say global.error. Remember, error is already a string, so we don't have to wrap that in a, the string function. You can just say global error. All right, so now these guys are complaining that global error and loading aren't a real thing, which is a fair point, right? We haven't included them in any way, and even if the game starts running, we don't have a global error or a loading. This is going to cause a problem because we got it in a draw event. It's going to try access a variable that doesn't exist. So to make sure it doesn't explode, let's go to room main. We can actually bring in that error while we're here. I can put it anywhere, it doesn't matter, it'll center itself. And then creation code, let's introduce global.error, set it to blank, global.loading, set it to true, because when this starts it is going to be loading. And just want to double check that these are actually persistent. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. Okay, well, let's actually see what that looks like. It should just say loading in the center of the screen when we fire this up. There it is. Okay, so these guys are still shown. They shouldn't be. So let's go make sure they are hidden. Let's go to buttons, object button, step event. Let's see here, image index, image alpha. Let's just add a visible equals, as long as we're not loading and not global.error. Sorry, this is actually supposed to say and global error is blank. Okay, so long as we're not loading and we don't have an error, then we can be visible. And remember, this visible property is then overwritten because object error does also have that in there and its own button. So it overwrites it by saying, here we can just say global error actually, because the other guy will take care of the loading situation. Cool. Now, as I said before, there are going to be two areas. Let's actually run this again. There's going to be two areas where we're going to be making a request to our server. And remember, our server is local to our machine, so it's not like far away on the internet somewhere. This is completely local. So yeah, our loading is working quite well. The two things we want to do is when we're on the main page, like the title screen, we want this continue button to be disabled if there are no saves, and we want it to be clickable if there are. So continue is actually going to make a request to our server over here, and it's going to be checking the endpoint called, we can use players, right? Players get, this guy. So what that's going to do, we're going to make a request to this players endpoint. And if there's a length greater than 0, then it means we've got players. So we can enable the continue button. And then once we click continue, we'll make another request to this players endpoint to actually get more of the detail about it. Now, usually what I do is I wouldn't want to make these requests twice if I knew they were in the same flow, but because this is a local, the latency is going to be non-existent basically, so we can do as many requests as we really want. Okay, so let's go to object continue. Let's close our remain. Here we go. Let's go to create. Let's do that. What I want to say is get. Now this is going to be a variable local to this object, and get is going to be an HTTP get. And don't get confused about, you know, HTTP and we're doing local stuff and all that. It doesn't matter. This isn't going to be connecting to the internet. We're going to say make a request to http ://local host 8080 /players/. See, so localhost is local to our machine. If we go to our server again, you'll see at the bottom of this, you'll see it'll say we're running, here we go, localhost on port 8080. So this whole server is running on the local machine. So long as our game accesses it on the local machine, we'll be in the money, right? And we don't actually have to set global.loading to true here because it should have been set initially. But I'm going to set it to true here because if we come back to this page, we're going to want to make another request to just ensure that the state is still a good one. Because, for example, if we're on the save screen, we could have the option to delete a save. That again will be coming a little later. And if so, it means we're going to be going back to the main page and it needs to load again to do another request. Okay, so now we have a reference to that HTTP get. We're telling that it's definitely loading when it creates this object. This button's inheriting from the parent, which should make sure that it's only visible if it's not loading and there is a blank error, so no error. So because we have a reference to that get, that HTTP get, we now need to add an event to listen for that asynchronously. So we're going to say asynchronous HTTP, and then inside here we're going to say, well, if ds map find value, everything's about ds maps in this, async load, here we're going to say id equals get. All right, so if our asynchronous event matches the one that we have over here, so if it's this endpoint, then we're going to manage the response inside here. Let's give ourselves a whole lot of space. Next up, we need to make sure that it was a valid message. If ds map find value async load, and then here we want to say the status is 0. So that's a valid response. Then here we want to say manage valid response, else we've got big issues, right? So it means that we made a request, but the response that came back wasn't good. Maybe the server is off, maybe it's corrupted, maybe something's not running, in which case we want to say global.error equals could not fetch data. Right? And at the end of this whole asynchronous experience, remember this is all async code, so it's not going to get here until it's done everything in here or in here. Global.loading equals false. So at this point we've made the request, we've handled what it was, if it was good or bad, and then here we're saying we've finished loading. So let's continue with some other thing. Okay, so what is a valid response? Well, we're going to use var result to get a dsmap find value, async load again, and that's going to be of the result property in that response. Okay, so now we've got the result. So if we go to our server over here, this result object is going to be the JSON that's coming back. So if I go to our get for players, so this is going to be the ID, the name, and the sprite of the player, and that's being returned here as JSON. We're stringifying the rows for all players. That's going to come back into this result object. Now this is JSON. Well, I mean, it's some representation of the data here. We need to convert this into a map object because GameMaker deals with maps. So we're going to say result map equals JSON decode the result. And we know that this is going to be a list of objects. So I'm going to say list equals ds map find value, and that's the result map, and the default is actually where it puts it when you decode the JSON. Okay, so that's that. This needs to be lowercase m. Fantastic. Now we don't really care about what's in the list. We just want to know that there are things in here. So we can say the enabled, which is a property on the button, which allows it to be hovered, or the enabled is also if it's semi-transparent. That's at 0.5 alpha. So it's going to be enabled if the ds list size of list, and list is that map that we've got from default, well, the default object in the result map, and that's greater than 0. So if the list has a length over there, then we can say, yeah, this continue button's enabled, right? And also always be sure to clean up your maps because they can take up memory if you don't clean them up. ds list destroy, and that's the list. And then here we want to say ds map destroy, and that's the result map. And also we want to say, well, if that was successful, then we're going to set global error to blank because we know there's no error. Let's save that. Let's actually see what happens. But before we see what happens, and also I can show you how the error works here, I want to go into our server, into our players over here, and I want to console log, similar to how we said added player with sprite. Here we want to say fetch some rows. And don't need backticks because we're not interpolating that string. Fetch some rows, simple as that, so we can actually see it here in our console when we hit it. Okay, so I'm gonna fire this up, and this is actually gonna fail because I'm not running the server, right? I'm not running the server, so we want it to fail. I want to see the loading animation, then I want to see the failure, and we can click retry and just make sure that works. Okay, so it's loading. Now this is gonna load until it times out. There we go, could not fetch data, and you'll notice here in our log, HTTP error, a connection with the server could not be established. That's perfect, right? So now let's go to our server. Here we're gonna run node server.js. There it is. Okay, connected to our GameDB. Remember from our last video, we actually have some data in GameDB. So if I click, actually we can go here and click retry, it'll try again. Oh, we see how instantaneous that was. That was very quick. We are local. We don't have to worry. A lot of people say, oh, if you're going to interact with databases, you create your server wrapper. It's going to create latency. You might as well just use any files and good luck with your relational database design. But I really don't think that that's a problem as we're experiencing right now. It is very quick. We'll keep in our minds that we need things to be quick. We don't want the user to feel like they're waiting for data, even though they're local to their system. So as you can see, that was fantastic. No problems. This is enabled because we have data. And if I go to the server, fetched some rows. See this logged it over there? It didn't log the error. It actually logged that things were good. And then we can actually look at clicking that continue. Okay, so then when we click continue, this is where we want to render the data or the players with their information. So let's go back out. Next up, let's go to our object saves. So object saves is going to work very similarly to object continue. We are going to have a create. I just want to grab these two because it's going to be hitting the same endpoint. And we need another async event, asynchronous HTTP, and we can steal this entire thing also because remember, it's the same event. All that changes is what's happening inside here. Right? So it's actually this line that we will be changing. Instead of checking the size of the list to determine what we need to do, we are actually going to be going through that list and creating instances of some sort of player object. In this case, we're going to be calling it that object selector over here. So for every player we have in our database, we're going to create a quote-unquote selector, which is going to allow the user to select it to then say, to then prompt further interaction, delete, save, continue, that kind of thing. And as we saw before, what this is going to do is it's going to just draw itself with this name. I'm using underscores here. Underscores are going to represent, for now at least, the properties we're setting from outside of this object. So we've got name and we've got selected. So the name is going to be shown 45 pixels below the center of this little story. And it's got the name. And then here, if you're selected, it's going to show this green box around to show you've clicked on it, and if you do click on it, it's going to deselect all other ones and select just this one. Okie dokie. So let's go to our saves. Inside here, what we want to do is I'm going to create two temporary variables, var xx and var yy. That's just to give us a starting point for rendering these. We're going to have a for loop. I'm going to say var I equals 0, I is less than, and here we do bring about ds list size list increment I by 1. Okay, so this means for every item in that list, it's going to be running one loop. So think about each loop as each individual player. Then next, I want to create a temporary map over here. Ds list find value list I, find the very first element in there. And before I do anything, I just want to make sure we do a ds map destroy. Trust me, you don't want to leave these things lying around. And here we can say, well, with instance create layer xxyy on the instances layer, this one represents room saves this over here, where we've got all our objects. And remember also, this object saves is sitting over here inside this room. So you load this room, it then does a loading, does another request, interprets that request and creates our little blocks. Alright, so let's get rid of that, get more space. So we've got instance create layer xxyy instances object selector. Alright. Because we're using a width over here, I can instantiate it with some interesting parameters. Now you're wondering why I'm using an underscore. Well, it's because I can't use an ID inside here, because ID is a reserved keyword in GameMaker. It's actually the identifier of the object, but we've got something called ID, which is an identifier of the player. So I'm just going to go for an underscore syntax, and then I'm standardizing those between the player's name, its ID, and the sprite itself. You'll see where needed. ds map find value in map, and now this value here is going to match the name of the column in the table. So if this is coming back for our user, we have three values: ID, name, and sprite that could be used here. So the first one is ID, the next one is name, so I can grab that. Oopsie, over there we're going to say name. And the only thing we can't standardize with this naming is the sprite index, because that we're actually setting as the reserved property. And this is going to be fun. This is going to be really fun. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Here's the problem. In our database, we're storing these sprites as strings, SPR adventurer 1 to 8. But how do you get the index? Remember, an index is a number, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because each one of these is zero. I think it's 0 base. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I didn't want to do that because if you reorder these, then things can go horribly wrong. So we're storing it as a string in our database, but we need to now reverse that string and map it back to an actual, sprite. So I saw there's actually a function we can use called asset get index, and you pass it the name it as a string, and it'll return 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. So if I say dsmap find value and value of map, and then this is going to be sprite again. This property is the property coming from our database. Then that'll actually work. This part will return SPR adventurer 1, and then asset get index will say, okay, well, the index for asset called SPR adventurer 1 is this, and that could be 0 or 2 or 17 or 99, doesn't matter. And that's going to set the sprite index correctly. So I find that quite fascinating. I've never had to use this before, believe it or not. And here I'm going to say selected equals I equals 0. So if this is the first player coming back from our database or in the set on the list, I'm going to set that as default selected. I don't want to have a state where nothing's selected, so it'll always default to selecting the first one. And here I'm going to increment the x coordinate by 150. So the y will stay the same, 100 pixels, but an x will increase by 150, and then it'll render the next selector 150 pixels to the right of the previous one. Okay, very good. We're going to destroy this map over here that we created, and then I can get rid of the space. And that'll again clean up the other maps created at the top. Now, if we save that, this actually should work. It should do everything we need. So let's fire this up and see. Okay, so see how quick that was. That load is like instantaneous. Now if I click continue, we might see a little bit of a load. It'll be very fast. And if it works, we should see a number of little blocks being rendered on the screen. Ah, there we go. Look at this. So now we have 4 blocks, and we can click them, and each one has a name: Jerry, Amy, Jim, Billy. If you remember from our previous video, these were the objects we created in our database. So just like that, you wouldn't even know that we're actually connecting to a real database right now. This isn't any files, this isn't any strings coming out of a text file somewhere. This is coming out of a real database local to the machine of this player. And this is real data. If I go back, it does another request because the data could have changed. Remember, in our continue screen, there are going to be various actions. One's going to be delete, so I could go and click German, I could click delete, save, confirm, yes, it'll delete, and then that we can configure to hit the delete endpoint, and one could go and delete all of these, which means that if one were to go back to the main menu, continue would not be able to be clicked. It'll be like new over here, it should be disabled, right? Oh, check that out. What's that doing? New is being clicked. Can I change that? Left pressed, if not enabled, return. Oh. Actually, what's happening is we're accidentally clicking retry. You see, retry is there. Okay, we need to fix that for a second. Let's go error visible. Okay, so this needs to be if not. Can I do? Oh, this is visible. Yeah, let's just say if not visible, return. We shouldn't be able to interact with that if it's not available. Okay, let's try again. Cool, very good. Right, so that is it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. In our next part, we're going to be interacting with our saves, so we will be able to delete previous saves, and we're also going to be implementing this new button. And those will knock down another 2 endpoints that we had created in our previous video tutorials. Please make sure you subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing here. There aren't many videos showing you how you can create your own wrapper, empowering you to code that yourself, as done in this video. If you want me to cover any specific topics of this, please let me know in the comments below. Project files can be found in the description. Also, if you like what I'm doing here, please check out my Patreon. I really do appreciate your support. So until next time, happy coding, and I'll see you then.